Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I hope there's plenty of food. Get more if it interests you and you have time. And I actually wrote down stuff today so I wouldn't blather like an idiot. So let's see. Today's workshop is the second of two events with Dr. Amy Slaton. She is been brought here by the Daniels Fund and Faculty Fund and Professional Development. And of course, the Humanities Department is also kind of hosting, and we are well represented by the folks here as well. Dr. Slaton is a professor of history at Drexel University. She holds a PhD in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on the history of technical expertise and work seen through the lens of historical ideas and human difference. Her most recent book, Race, Rigor, and Selectivity in U.S. Engineering, The History of an Occupational Color Line, follows racial ideologies in engineering higher education since the 1940s. And so we have a copy of the book in the Ethics Nook, a.k.a. the Daniels Fund Ethics Library. And her current book project, All Good People, Diversity, Difference, and Opportunity in High-Tech America, describes the limits of American commitments to equity around race, gender, LGBTQ identities, disabilities, as those who are expressed in the training of the nation's industrial workforce. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Slaton. Oh, right. I'm just going to walk away with that.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to those of you who were also here yesterday for bearing up under the repeated intro. Thank you for the intro. I am so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to have a chance to work together. Yesterday was great, and I loved sharing my ideas and having feedback, but I feel like this session gives us a chance to work together. And of course, my needs are paramount, and I intend to go away with all of your ideas. So I'm super happy to be here. And I do want us to introduce ourselves to one another, but there's one thing I want to do first. And I want to go around the room and do a small exercise before we say anything else, before we even say our names or anything like that. And what I would like to ask you is to, as we go around the room, to please tell us one thing that people would pretty much figure out about you just because you walk in the room, just by taking a look at you, and one thing they couldn't possibly know. So I would say my answer would be, okay, so I think by looking at me, you'd know I'm not in the first blush of youth. I'm in middle age, late middle age, whatever. You kind of know that by looking at me, the gray hair, whatever. You wouldn't know that you wouldn't know if I take blood pressure medication. You wouldn't know if I have tried all my life to learn to play the violin and failed, that I'm very frustrated by my lack of dexterity. There's all kinds of things you just wouldn't know by knowing about me. And I don't really care what you offer, but if you don't mind sharing something you pretty much figure folks know about you when you walk in, and something you don't mind sharing that they don't know about you, and I don't really care what that is. Okay, it does not have to be anything about your body or your identity, just something that nobody would be likely to know about you just from you walking in the room, okay? So don't need names yet, don't need pronouns yet, just something that people would likely know about you if you walked into the room, and something people would likely not know about you, okay? Can we start here?
Okay. That's a bad word. Okay, so you would know about me walking into the room that I am not thin. I am not of average weight. What you wouldn't know about me is that I am a creative writer.
Very cool. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing these. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I would say you would likely know that I am female, I think, or identify as female, and then you would likely not know that I'm extremely nearsighted because of your contacts.
Ah, interesting. Thank you.
You would probably know or see that I'm very tall. I'm not standing right now, but I'm tall for a girl. You would not know that I have a chronic illness that I was diagnosed with when I was 6 years old.
And it's fine if you repeat. I mean, because we all have commonalities too. Thank you. Thanks.
Because you would likely know that I'm American. Not likely know that I was born and raised in Alaska and consider that a pretty important part of my identity.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to the back. You can also decline if you're not comfortable. That's totally fine. We'll have plenty to talk about, but yeah.
You would know that I wear glasses. You don't wear contacts. Can't do it. You wouldn't know that I have migraines.
You would know that I'm one of the youngest people in this room, and you probably wouldn't know that I sit on a computer all day.
It's true.
I think that most people know when I walk into a room, especially on this campus, that I'm transgender. I don't think that they know that I come from a single-parent household.
Most people would probably assume that I identify as male. I probably would not know that I have a 14-year-old daughter.
Cool, thank you.
You'd probably notice that I am shorter, but you wouldn't know that I am an elite competitive powerlifter.
So for me, you would probably think I'm fairly young, and wonder how old I actually am. And one thing that you probably wouldn't know is that I recently adopted a puppy, and he's taking up so much of my time.
We did notice the bags under your eyes. That's okay. Right.
You would probably notice that I have bags under my eyes. That I'm a tall, able-bodied male. You probably wouldn't know that I come from a non-traditional household in rural Baptist Michigan.
Walking in, it's pretty obvious, yeah, I'm a white girl. Identify as white. What you wouldn't know is I'm adopted.
Interesting.
You would know that I am bald and bald-ish. And what you wouldn't know is that I don't eat pork. What you wouldn't know is I absolutely love Arabic poetry.
Interesting.
Yes, you would know I'm fairly short. And you wouldn't know I have 2 pet rats.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
So you would probably notice that I'm married, would not know that I'm incredibly introverted, or that I used to teach elementary school.
That what? Sorry.
That I used to teach elementary school.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
So you probably wouldn't know that I'm African American, but you probably don't know that my DNA is 25% European.
Thank you. A couple more.
So you probably know that I'm a little bit brown. So people try to guess whether that's Latin America or the Middle East. They usually go with those two regions.
It's a fun game, right?
You wouldn't know that I come from a household of divorced parents.
The bad part of going last is I'm going to do every other.
No, you're not last. Chin is going to be last. Yeah.
You would know that I'm also a shorter female, and you wouldn't know that I'm an adopted parent.
Cool. Chin, you want to?
Yeah, so you probably would notice that I'm Asian based. You would not know actually I'm a 4th generation carpenter. So my father, grandfather, my great-grandfather, so carpenters, they expect me to be a carpenter. I decided to be not.
Wait, to be a what? I'm sorry.
Carpenter.
Carpenter. Oh, wow. Wow. So you broke from some kind of heritage. Wow, okay. Did we grab everybody who wanted to jump in? Okay, so really interesting variety, always interesting what we come up with when asked these questions. But there's something in the two categories that I want to talk about for a minute before we do any other talking today. And that is that many of the things that people don't know about us are things that may come with, I think, may come with, not necessarily with stigma, but certainly with questions like, oh, a non-traditional background or adoptive background, a chronic illness, I can't read my own handwriting. You know, a particular ethnic heritage, things that are somewhat mysterious about us, potentially stigmatizing, things we may have to kind of navigate. Now, there are plenty of those in the first category too, but there's a lot of things in that first category that seem kind of like, oh yeah, those are the ones that we don't. Those are the ones we can easily tell about people, and I will mention a few that we have: white, non-white, white and brown, Asian, maybe American. But we have things like age. A lot of people mentioned age. We had a couple mentions of height or weight, gender, or gender identifications. And what I think the first category shows is how comfortable we are using the categories about ourselves, right? And how part of our knowing ourselves, right, involves using the categories. Right? Now that's also true of the second stuff, but the second list of things is things that, I think we test what it means to be those things. I think we test what others think of us, right? A couple of you mentioned things that might invoke questions or curiosities in that first identifier. But think about it for a second. Think how readily we describe ourselves to ourselves in terms of our age and our weight, right? We can even put aside gender and race for a second. And I think there's something in the way those unproblematic, unquestioned categories work for us about ourselves and others that holds some really interesting lessons about how the more complex and stigmatized or marginalizing identifiers work. So I wanted to have on the table a wide collection of categories that we can think of as categories, not as minority status, not as marginalizing, not as problematic, not as stigmatizing, but things that we can say, okay, here are the standard categories that we walk around with and use about ourselves and others, right? And the striking things that we learn when we stop and look at the stuff that we never doubt about ourselves, that we have an age, that we have a weight, that we have a vision capacity, right? That don't, I think, raise a lot of questions about how we come to have those labels for most of us. I think this group is probably pre-selected for reflecting on this stuff. But I think we can look at those and get a very strong sense that a lot of the work we can do, that we want to do about diversity, about inclusion, about equity, could be put through a lens of knowing. How we know ourselves, how we know others, what counts as knowledge about individuals. That, of course, accrues into knowledge about groups, right? And I wanted to do that exercise so that the natural categorizing things that we do in our lives that we don't particularly find troubling or vexatious or stigmatizing, right, give us something to work with so we can kind of make the familiar strange, but also just get in touch with what categorizing feels like. And not necessarily fall back on our familiar ideas that diversity is a goal that we absolutely can never doubt. It's a prescribed answer to a social problem. I think it's probably a programmatic commitment for many of you. It's a programmatic commitment for mine. But I don't want to talk about it that way. I don't want to talk about it as something that's necessarily or naturally good. I want to talk about the ideal of diversity as a particular prescribed set of social relations, and one that pivots on knowing, one that pivots on figuring out who's walked into our chemistry lab or our classroom or our career fair, right? And I want to take diversity as a goal, as the critical subject, as an ideal that has a history, an aim that has a history, it has social origins and impacts. There's a reason that diversity came to seem the solution, and And that has a lot to do with how we defined the problem, right? As some of you were here yesterday, so that I made some points about racial and extractive capitalism, and the point that, okay, inclusion seems very nice, but it's not the same as redistributive justice, right? And I think if we can sort of talk about diversity as a critical topic instead of a necessarily desirable goal, I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying I'm not there yet. I want to talk about it, how it gets to be a goal and what it means for it to be the goal. We'll learn some new stuff. Now, of course, you could say this is an anti-diversity approach. I think that's a fair approximation of what you eventually will come to see about my work. And that is an argument that is very, very important for the right. It's taken up by a lot of very rightist, very bigoted, very supremacist groups. It's also taken up by just some neoconservative, neoliberal voices. Some arguments for a post-racial, a post-identity politics society. And that's a danger I have to work with. But I think it also has to be argued from the left that diversity is a self-consoling and limiting reform project. And that's what I want to talk about. I think we need to demand probably more and stronger interventions and resistances, not fewer, as the right might say. But these need to delve into why diversity seems like the solution. And I specifically want to get to today a couple ideas about how I think queer and disability studies can support this intervention, right? By doing the kind of thing that we just did with that really, simple exercise of saying, okay, wait, what works for us is a category we're comfortable with, right? How do our categories, how do we come to use them as categories and differences, the making of human difference? And I think if we want to get to the core of how identity functions in STEM institutions, which I'm guessing all of you care about on some level, I think queer and disability studies offers us particularly sharp tools. So we don't have a ton of time, but I want to share my enthusiasms with you and then hear your responses, okay? So now, if you feel like sharing your first name, if you feel like sharing your preferred gender pronouns, that's great. I would love to know the names of the people I'm chatting with. You can also skip this entire step if you want. But I'm Amy, and I would use she and her.
And I'm Sandy, and I would use she and her.
Sarah, she and her. Chelsea, she and her.
Katie, she and her.
Elaine, she and her.
Peter, he, him, his.
Max, he, him, his, or they, them, theirs.
He, him, his.
Heather, she, her, hers. Amy, she, her.
Jean, he, him.
Catherine, she, her.
Hussein, he, him.
Sarah, they, them.
Stephen, he, him.
Garrett, he, him.
Chen, he, him.
Juan, he, him.
And I will try to absorb names. Probably is not going to happen. Usually it takes me 2 weeks, not 2 hours, but thank you so much. Okay, so we've introduced ourselves, and so I'll just tell you what I hope will happen in the next hour and a half or so. And I want to give a quick overview of the literature and the ideas I'm trying to share from queer and disability studies, and how I think these can support a really incisive and I hope constructive engagement with equity and inequity. And then I want to turn to, and first I'll talk a bit about disabilities, critical disability studies, and I'll talk about queer theory, and then how they overlap in a really interesting body of work called CRIP theory, that very intentionally blends methodologies from both, that they blend in other settings as well. And then we'll talk, and I hope to get some, I hope that you guys will help me test the value of some of these perspectives, especially against experiences that you've had either in classrooms, in workplaces, as people with influence and authority, or as people in less authoritative, student-like or employee, positions. So I'm hoping to give us a good chunk of time for testing these ideas. I'm going to show you a video shortly. I also asked Chin to copy an article for me so you guys would have it, because it's one of my, I find it a very useful article, but also because I'm going to ask you guys to read a couple paragraphs so we can talk about them at some point, but just a couple paragraphs, not a lot, okay? So, and of course at any point, if what I'm saying does not make sense, does not seem generative, or in any way does not track, just wave hands and we will stop and talk, because that's certainly more enjoyable for all of us than me just, and it not being good for you guys. So this is really okay. You can raise your hand, wave your hand, whatever at any point. But we will have a ton of time when I will just try to really make a conversation. Okay, so let's see if I can start with a bit of an overview of what I generally see as probably the functional description and deployment of notions of diversity in literature or studies or professional practices that take that up as a serious challenge, right? It would be one thing for us to sit here and talk about these alt-right, far-right, Trumpian dismantling of the whole notion. That's really important work, and I do that work as a historian. But for today, I think it's more a better use of our time to get a good picture of what some of the sincere, honest, sophisticated deployments of diversity are, because those are the ones that are falling short in ways I think we can really engage with together. Okay, so I think a lot of scholarship on diversity has made it very clear to us that there are multiple levels in which inequity or aggression or violence and harm or inequity play out in STEM learning and work. And you'll notice that I'm also aggregating everything from, a mines classroom or a community college classroom to a factory or a elementary school classroom. I think diversity operates in our country much the way innovation does, like I talked about yesterday, where it's a big idea that carries things with it. So I'm going to talk across all kinds of settings, which is totally impractical for application, but I think it's the only way to a really reflective practice here. So I think a lot of scholarship on STEM about injustice and inequity in STEM learning and work frames multiple levels of challenge, right? We have micro interactions, microaggressions that we might see as like the interpersonal day-to-day stuff that pivots on ascriptions of race, or I would say ascriptions of age or weight or height or disability or sexuality, right? So we have these micro social moments. We have institutional policies and practices that I'm guessing a lot of you have dealt with, right? If you're faculty and staff, those are policies, regulations, and norms. We also have laws in this country. They're rapidly coming under assault, but we've had some pretty significant legal protections and definitions of communities and identities that need protection by law, anti-discrimination law in hiring and education, and definitions of hate crimes pivot on the idea that there are categories of identity that are subject to hate crimes. So we've got we've got institutional policies and practices, and then we have cultural conditions, which are sort of the openly circulating values and norms. And I know I'm painting with a very broad brush, but I'm kind of trying to mirror how the engagements with the problem of diversity work. Some focus, there's a lot of great research even coming out of folks at Mines, but other pedagogical scholarship on those interpersonal classroom or workplace interactions. There's a lot of great political science and legal studies work on the role of policies, regulations, and laws in equity, in diversity efforts. And then there's some fabulous work across, history, sociology, anthropology, critical theory, literary studies on cultural ideas of difference. And that could be race theory, that can be feminist theory, and some of that literature that addresses these cultural meaning-making projects is some of the queer and disabilities literature I want to talk about. And I think if we were trying to systematically study any of these, if any of us participate in any of those kinds of scholarship or inquiry, we'd have to admit rapidly that it's a pretty big job, and we pretty quickly come to see that these three levels are not really separable in any stable or permanent way. So let's say you live in a state that is cracking down on illegal immigration, illegal immigrants. Your classrooms are probably going to feel different, or they should feel different, than if you're living in a state where that's not a problem, where you don't have kids in the classroom who may not be sure what's going to happen to their family, their life themselves, right? So that's kind of a mesh of, interpersonal sociabilities are going to change, but the laws and policies have a significant role to play there. If you're in a city with strong public education supported by a willing tax-paying population, right? People who've elected politicians who want more public education and will pay the higher taxes, right? Which I'd say is a kind of maybe a culture of that city, right? If you've got well-paid teachers, okay, so that's a set of policies that affects the climate of the classroom, right? The ambient commitments to diversity and inclusion are going to start to feel like a norm. So it's really, the separation between the three levels is artificial. It's helpful to make our studies practical, but really once you start looking, you can also mash them together. And by the way, I will use the words diversity and inclusion, but I hope by the end of our time together, you'll understand that I don't take those as unproblematic goals. That's really not my point. And this is why, and actually, this is why messages of rainbow places, like the mosaic of human faces and diversity. And if you were here yesterday, I shared a really hallucinatory screenshot that I just went to Google Images and put in diversity, and it's all, my favorite one is the one, it's like instead of people, it's colored pencils of all colors, right? It's all this clip art of the rain. I think the diversity as the multicolored mosaic is worse than useless to me. It hides all three of those layers, right? Certainly ignoring the structural features of social relations and opportunity, which I talked about yesterday. So it's also true that because those three layers make up one, pudding of many ingredients, a change in one is likely to bring a change in another. If your institution doesn't reward flexible assessment, right, your interpersonal relationships with your professor or your students, right, is gonna really the way things are graded is gonna feel different, and that's gonna make the social abilities feel different. If you, when women of color are elected to Congress, it's easier to imagine a materials engineering PhD program with no women of color being somewhat problematic. In other words, we don't really even know what the effects are being, but we know there will be effects for both positive and problematic things with these complex situations. And I think what queer and disability studies can offer are certain reconceptualizations that do not turn away from the complexity, do not self-console by imagining that, ooh, look who walked in the room, people of diverse identities, or we have achieved 38% women in chemical engineering, which are not bad things in the immediate experience of them. They're not bad for individuals necessarily, but they do not translate to structural change, and they actually can cause more harm. I think what queer and disabilities offers is the model of not expanding who is present, not representing the underrepresented, not a model of inclusion, but rather questions about how does the who even come about? How do the categorizations work? Where do they emerge? How do they stick? And who gets to say, right? And as I hope you'll eventually read more of this article, because this author does a fabulous job of sort of going right into a seemingly extremely impenetrable discourse, management discourse. Actually, there's two, Bendel and Fleischman, and showing how this can be seen through these queering epistemologies, right? And I think what we have to get ready for, if we are serious about this, is some serious discomfort. Because I think feeling that you're making people welcome, right? Feeling like you're not happy that there are no women of color in the mechanical engineering program, right? I think can stop short of intervention and resistance. because it feels better than not doing it, because it feels like you're on the side of the right stuff. And I'm going to give you a very quick example before we dive, and then we'll dive into some specifics from the disabilities literature. And I was going to say, this is from an institution that will remain nameless, except it's Drexel. So I'm going to tell you this, okay? So, because it's ridiculous, right? Where would I be attending the diversity event that I'm about to describe to you, right? This is in my own institution, and it is a perfect example of how either comfort, self-consolation, or even controlled discomfort, right, are really not your friend if what you want to do is make for a more equitable workplace, more equitable institution, a more equitable community. So let me give you my examples. I'm going to talk about Diversity Day, which was a diversity lunch, right? Which, like, the minute you see those two words together, you're like, what? Right? It's like vegetables and meat. I don't know. But this was a diversity lunch in 2018, and it was here was the event. The event was 5 or 6 tables like these with like maybe 8 or 9 chairs around each. And everybody could come to the event and choose where they wanted to sit. And there was a disabilities table, a Muslim table, a Hispanic table, African American table, and an LGBTQ table. And at each table, the university had requested a sort of a mentor or an interlocutor or whatever to represent that category of that community, and each one was wearing a big button that said "Ask Me Anything." And halfway through the lunch, you were supposed to change tables so that you'd have 2 experiences, right? And it was absolutely intended to break down stereotypes, to break down reticence with encountering people who you felt that, well, you knew you had 2 things that you had about other people. If you were participating here, you had them in some category in your mind that you might want to know more about, but you also knew that about them. Oh, this is what you are. You're an LGBTQ, representative. You're a black representative. You're a Muslim representative, right? So the idea was that you go to a table that you want to improve your understanding, right? So of course, one thing that's going on here is you're operating from the notion that you already know that that's what that person is. But so a couple things happened during this event that for me capture how the knowing itself becomes the harm, how the knowing and the categorization itself does the violence. And part of it is just that it's very essentializing, right? It's like the opposite of intersectionality, right? It's the opposite of saying that, yeah, you're in a wheelchair, but you're also, from, I don't know, you're also, I don't know, I'm trying to think of good intersectional examples. You're black and you're also of a particular gender. You're in a wheelchair, but you're also a mathematical genius. And there's like, to decide the meaning of the body that has walked in the room, right, is already part of the violence, okay? On the other hand, those things matter in our culture. And I'm not going to take up the rightist position that, no, I don't see color, I don't see the wheelchair. It's bullshit, right? But at this lunch, you were supposed to sit down and figure out what the Muslim person was, figure out what the wheelchair user was. So a couple things happened that kind of capture the problematics here. So first of all, the person running the event welcomes everybody and stands up and says, I hope you will move during our lunch from one table to another. Perhaps you will start at the disabilities table and move to the Hispanic table. Perhaps you will start at the Muslim table, and then you will move to the LBG. I can never get those crazy letters straight, right? And I think in her mind she was sort of expressing, it's like, I'm humbled by the problem. We're all in this together, except that it was such a profoundly disrespectful approach. Isn't it crazy, all those letters, right? So that was a little, stuff like that kept happening. And then I sat at a couple tables as an ethnographer, of course, and I arrived at the Muslim table, and there was, I think he was a staff member. It wasn't faculty. All the leaders at the tables were either faculty or staff. I think he was a staff member, administrator, African American gentleman who said, let me just tell you right off the bat, they couldn't find a Muslim person, Islamic, faculty or staff member, and someone with, Islamic heritage. So they asked me. But you can ask me anything, right? So the first question, and I'm not judging the person who asked the question, I'm just reporting for the moment. The first question was, a white woman said, well, I just don't understand why, women of Islamic faith cover themselves and hide themselves and wear the garments, wear the garb, which is a question. We're going to bracket the question for a second, but I want to share the answer. The gentleman leading the discussion said, well, I have the same question because I don't know why these kids leave their church. These are strong family heritages in Philadelphia, and it's true, there are many, many black churches in Philadelphia where the same families have belonged for generations and generations, and some people of the current generation don't attend those churches. They have joined Muslim congregations or moved towards a different faith. And this interlocutors, and he was like, I don't get it. Why would you? They're really, it's a really, it's inexplicable to me, and it's really not good for the black community. And in a sort of sociological sense, you could take all those things and you could ask about them. But you'd probably also have to ask about the meaning of the faith that the people took up, and the meaning of the practices and the heritages of women's garment, right? But that isn't, his response was, I don't know, it's a mess. And I just think someone should look at how all those mosques in West Philadelphia are opening up and who's giving them, who's renting space them. And he had a whole deeply concerned image in his head about the rise of new Muslim communities in his neighborhood that worried him, and there was a negative, and he couldn't imagine asking questions about it. He was just worried, right? And so what I want to say here is I'm not trying to stigmatize him. I'm just saying that how this event could possibly have gotten beyond everybody's existing presumptions is just, I have no idea, right? I mean, I just don't know how the structure of such an event, which pivots on the notion of people learning more, but is actually founded on already knowing what you think, of depending on people to represent entire communities, right, as the representative. I'm gonna
resemblance between the way that you ascribe to your gender and sexuality and the way that they approach disability like statement.
Yeah, I think that's a really great parallel for sure. Other things you might come away with or remember?
It's the kind of like poor you, that real like, oh, I suck to be you, and then that people do that in order to feel better about themselves.
Yeah.
Which is not really a surprise, except for ouch.
Yeah, I think she captures in a very simple schematic way that our sort of our uptake of our accessing tragedy or dysfunction or misfortune when we encounter a person we perceive as disabled is really serving us. It's serving us. And the whole impulse of kindness and generosity and inclusion services us. And that's not going to make big political change. Yeah. Anyone else want to offer a takeaway at all that they can come back to it too? So let me pivot the question to one that's more specific. Does she help us think critically about the experience of knowing? Can we use what Stella Young just shared to move along with my notion that we better think about the knowing part of what we're doing? Does it connect for you guys yet in an interesting way?
Do you mean, I'm thinking of, it's called the Johari window, and it came out in the 80s, and it's all about, you have like the arena, what you know about you, and what everyone else knows about you. And then the blind spot, the facade, and the unknown. And the reason why I'm thinking about that, being on this campus, is I think when we put people into a certain, I'm just trying to see if I understand what you're trying to get us to think about, but when we put people into a certain category, then once we've done that, if I'm hearing you correctly, then we sort of check off the box, I know this about you now, and now I can move on. Right? So one of my colleagues came and gave a talk a year ago about Muslims in World War I. And the French, to their shock, built all of these mosques in France because they thought that if they built all the mosques in France, they would get all the Muslims to fight in the war with them. So they had sort of decided.
Check.
Right.
Right.
They decided that. Well, certainly, if Muslims see all these mosques, then they must think that the French love us.
Right.
And we'll be happy Muslims, and we're going to fight alongside the French.
Right. Assimilation.
So they didn't do that though. And so the French were always surprised.
Really interesting.
Well, how come you all didn't support us and you weren't more supportive? Well, it's because you assumed foolishly that just because you thought that we're all Muslims that you didn't know anything else about us.
Yeah.
And they didn't take the time to really think about other kinds of identities.
Yeah.
That might have actually maybe have drawn them in.
Right.
Is that what you're getting?
Yeah, I think that's a great historical example. It's easy to visualize that happening, right? And it's also, it's not so much, it's not like inspiration for him, but it's making some big assumptions about what will be of value to the other people. So I think that's a great example. And I think, maybe I should, because I don't want to, shortchange my other examples here, but let me see if I can get it connected to STEM in a way that might make it very immediately clear, which is, notice how Stella Young says, when you look at, she's kind of known as Stella, when she was a comedian, it was just Stella, so I keep forgetting to say her last name. She says that when you look at me and say that, oh, what a good attitude, you're probably not going to notice that there's no ramp, right? It's when you assume that both the problem and the overcoming reside in my body, right, you don't think about the environment. You don't think about the social landscape that has made me into a disabled person. Because when there's a ramp, I don't have an access issue, right? So in a way, I think when we look at the first generation college student who comes into our lab, when we look at the high achieving Hispanic engineering student who represents diversity and a representation of an underrepresented group, we may have encountered that person. I'm speaking sort of as a professor. I'm speaking from the authority looking outward. But we might approach that student with high expectations, which is great because we don't want to use deficit models, right, where we assume that people of color or disabled people can't do things. We may approach that person with a sense that we respect and honor their achievements in spite of their color. You see where this is going? It's like, but all of these things, and even the sense of welcoming, right, are not, first of all, they don't really see the person for the experiences they've had, both positive and challenging. It doesn't see them for their capacities and, like as Stella says, the fact that for the blind person, the books that are not in Braille are a true impediment. We don't see either the person or the world we live in very clearly when we're operating from the check, we did it, right? And I think that while her critiques of inspiration porn are really valuable, especially for that, they really correct us from thinking that our kindness is a particularly generous thing. I think there's a bigger lesson here, which is in STEM fields, right? Whether you're an employer or a teacher, an employee or a student, there really is no such thing as achievement independent of our idea what counts as achievement for that individual. And we make those decisions in the midst of these categorizations, in the midst of these ideas that, oh, this is a person who has, this is a minority student who, by being here makes the world, makes our institution better. This is a disabled person who represents our tolerance for disabled people in the lab, right? When really the good feeling, the generous feeling is based on keeping that person in a particular identity, but also mistakes that person's experience. And I'm saying that experience can include, positive identity-related experiences. It can include the impediments that Stella talked about, like no ramp, no Braille, right? We don't see either when our project is inclusion achieved, right? So I think that's something that disability studies has really helped us see. And if you're interested, I can tell you much more about, my work has thought a lot about, my first book looked at the nature of rigor in engineering, but I hadn't yet done a lot with disability studies, and now I sort of understand how rigor and merit and productivity, it could be the productivity of a factory worker, all those things produce both abled people Okay, thanks. I was going to ask you guys a question. Okay, so one of the things that first paragraph offers, okay, so queer theory's key move, I'll use a quote, and they're quoting Parker here. The key move is to question the boundary, not simply to demonize that which lies on one side and to celebrate that which lies on the other, okay? Now, none of us, I think in this room, ever intend to demonize the person of minority background who walks into our meeting or our classroom or our workplace. We don't mean to demonize, right? But I think the key move to question the boundary, right, is something that is really important to us. So so it says key move is to question the boundary, not simply to demonize one side and celebrate the other, right? Even if we want to celebrate both sides of the boundary, oh, I'm going to celebrate whiteness, I'll also celebrate brownness. I'll celebrate abledness, I'll celebrate disabledness, right? I think the argument is that's not going to get us to a just world. Anybody want to kind of, you don't even have to agree with it, but anybody kind of want to take it the next step? Why might we say that even celebrating both identities, the majority and the minority, the marginalized and the non-marginalized, doesn't do much for reform? What's the problem with that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it won't really get to structural, historical fault lines, right? So I mean, if you just have a whole bunch of people of African ancestry on campus, that's fine. But if their experiences, what they bring, are not really deeply woven into the culture